Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm R.B. Brenner. I'm the director of the School of Journalism here at the University of Texas at Austin. Every semester, we try to have a couple of special events for our students to expose them to people and ideas that they wouldn't otherwise get through our traditional classes. And today's event certainly qualifies. Before I introduce Mike Kramer, the executive director of the Texas Program in Sports and Media, I wanted to say something with Mr. Deford in the room that I told my students. Mr. Deford is one of the major reasons I'm a journalist today. Growing up reading him was beyond an inspiration. And what I would do is I would read his story once, and then I'd read it about 6 other times right in a row, and then I would rip it out of the magazine, there was no digital in those days, and put it in a folder. And years later, when I was writing a story and I wanted to be inspired, I would pull out pieces. And a lot of my early work was, in a way, kind of parodying, or, mimicking my heroes, and then over time you develop a style of your own. So while you're here, I just want to thank you for that. So now, this is Mr. Mike Kramer, Executive Director of the Texas Program in Sports and Media, and I know many of the students in the room are interested in sports journalism. Mr. Kramer, before coming to UT to start the program, was the president of the Texas Rangers and also the Dallas Stars. So welcome.
Yep. Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. My talk is very, very quick. I just get the great honor every year for the past 6 years of introducing Frank Deford. Several years ago, over a cup of coffee, Frank graciously agreed to lend his name to an annual lecture here at the University of Texas, and also to give us his papers and archives, as he called them, such as they are. And he has done that. He's fulfilled that. We continue to get things from Frank, and because he continues to be this great, productive journalist and writer. He is actually just coming out with a new book, which I'm going to give a plug for. It's called "I'd Know That Voice Anywhere." It's a collection of his favorite vignettes, if you will, that he does on NPR every Wednesday morning, or has done for about 30 years, Frank? 30 more?
80,
yeah. Yeah, so, or more. And over the course of that time, he had done hundreds and hundreds of pieces on NPR, and he has collected his favorites in this little book. That's a wonderful little book. It's anything from Al Gore to Al McGuire in here. And I told Frank this morning that I had a favorite. I've already gotten through the book because it's one of those, it's great to pick up and read a few chapters and then come back to it. There was a piece in here that he wrote about Al McGuire. Back in 1978, I was in law school at Marquette when they won the national championship, and Al McGuire was the coach. I got to know Al McGuire, and I thought I knew Al McGuire, and it would take me hours if you wanted to hear me talk about Al McGuire. The beauty of Frank Deford is in a couple of pages. He said as much about Al McGuire that it would take me a couple of hours to do it. And he did it better and beautifully, and what a great piece. And that's just one of the pieces that's in this book. Frank has been called, this was my favorite on the back of his book, the San Francisco Chronicle said, Frank Deford is sports writing Sinatra. I loved it. There's all sorts of other great praise for Frank on the back of the book, which I'll avoid for right now. Suffice it to say that he's here every year. He's been a great help to us, and we get the benefit of America's greatest living sports writer, and maybe the greatest of all time. So, Frank, would you come up?
Thank you very much. McGuire, by the way, had a fascinating way of speaking his own language. And instead of saying enjoy the moment, which I want you all to do when the speaker comes out, he said, celebrate the temporary, which makes no sense whatsoever except when Al McGarr said it. And finally, I understood what celebrate the temporary means. So please celebrate the temporary for the next hour or so when you meet Andrew Zimbalist, who may be an economist, but he's best, in my thinking, described in musical terms. He's a crossover artist. While he's best known as being an authority on sports economics, he has published such tomes as The Cuban Economy, Movement and Analysis of Socialist Performance. His articles have appeared in the likes of the Harvard Business Review, and among his 24 books, one of them was even a children's book. He's been a commentator on NPR, testified before Congress, taught in both Europe and Asia as well as North America, been a visiting fellow at Harvard, and served as an expert witness, it seems, at every trial in the United States that has anything to do with sports and commerce. Not only that, but his students at Smith give him high marks. Writes one, and I quote, Professor Zimbalist may seem intimidating, but he's really not scary. And this should be a relief to you all right now. No, academic though he may be, he is able to make his subject understandable, even to stupid laymen like me. He's really not scary. Andrew Zimbalist has written on almost every phase of sports and money and is simply universally recognized as the leading sports economist in the country. Someone, in fact, who's made us appreciate and understand the nexus between sports and finance. I'm both so delighted and proud that he is this year's Deford lecture speaker, and it's now my honor to introduce him to you, Andrew Zimbalist.
Thank you so much. How do I live up to that? Is this working? Yes? Yeah, can you hear me? Doesn't matter if it's working or not. Can you hear me? Yeah? Good. So, it's an unbelievable honor for me to be here and to be introduced by Frank, because just like previous speaker, what Mike Kramer was saying, I've admired Frank's work for several decades. I regard him as the 21st century Mark Twain. Not only does he write about sports, by the way, but he's also written, I think, 8 or 9 novels, and I understand he has another one coming out. So it's a great pleasure for me to come back to Austin, Texas on this occasion. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk about one of my new books, which is called Circus Maximus, the economic gamble behind hosting the Olympics and the World Cup. And in order to get into the subject, I want to tell you a story about how I got involved in looking at the economics of the Olympics. I had done a lot of work on the economics of stadiums and arenas. When you build a new stadium or a new arena with public money, how does that affect the local economy? And as a result of that, I was called up by a man named Jerry Schoenfeld, who was the CEO of the Schubert Corporation. They're the largest producer of Broadway plays in New York City. In 2003, there was a plan afoot to have New York City host the 2012 Olympics. And there was an Olympic organizing committee. And they were going to do a lot of the construction. In order to host the Summer Olympics anyway, you need about 33, 35 venues. And they were going to put several of those venues in Manhattan. And a lot of people liked the idea back in 2003 because, of course, this was just 2 years after 9/11. The World Trade Centers had come down, and New York City felt a little bit denuded. They wanted to rebuild, and this was part of the patriotic notion of bringing New York City back to life. But the main piece of the idea of rebuilding Manhattan was that they were going to build an Olympic stadium, an 80,000 capacity Olympic stadium, between 10th Avenue and 12th Avenue and between 31st Street and 33rd Street. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Manhattan, but that particular 6 square block area is the train yards for the Long Island Railroad. So that if you stand next to that 6 block area and you look down, all you see is tracks and trains. So the plan was to build a concrete slab over that, euphemistically called a deck, to build a deck over that, and then once the deck was there, you'd be able to build a stadium on top of it, and that was going to be the Olympic Stadium. In order not to have a white elephant is a building that you build for a particular occasion, and then after the occasion is over, there's virtually nothing to do with it. Maybe you can do something with it, but it's not economically justified because it not only costs hundreds of millions of dollars to build, but it costs several $1 million a year just to maintain and operate. So the idea was they were going to build this Olympic Stadium, and then they were going to convert it into a football stadium for the New York Jets. The New York Jets, of course, now have a different home, but back then they didn't have their own home. And they'd get to play 8 regular season football games there a year, plus 2 exhibition games. So 10 out of 365 days a year, the stadium would be used as an NFL football stadium. And maybe there'd be a Bruce Springsteen concert, maybe there'd be an evangelist who came, maybe there'd be 3 or 4 other events. So 15 out of 365 days, you'd have use of the stadium. Now, what's interesting about this plan to me, what was interesting to me about it was that once you build a concrete slab, and they projected that to cost $400 million, by the way, and that was the projected cost. There definitely would have been massive cost overruns. But let's take a figure, $400 million. Once you build that, you've created, in my view, some of the most valuable real estate in the whole world. Because this is central Manhattan. It's adjacent to Broadway. It's elevated. And so it looks out over the Hudson River and the New Jersey Palisades. And you were going to put a football stadium there that was used maybe 15 days out of the year. Not a very good use of scarce urban real estate. But that was the plan. Jerry Schoenfeld, the head of the Schubert Corporation, was concerned not only because he thought it was a bad plan from a social planning point of view, but because his theaters would be negatively impacted by that. Because after all, the New York Jets would play Sunday afternoons, and Sunday afternoon matinees was a mainstay of Broadway. And moreover, every once in a while, the Jets would have a game at night, and that would also conflict with Broadway, and make traffic in central Manhattan unbearable, and make parking even more unbearable, and so people wouldn't go to Broadway. That was his secondary concern. So he asked me to look into the Olympic process. And that's what I did. And basically what I found, and what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon, is that it doesn't pay economically, that the circumstances are such, the forces and the structures of the way the bidding takes place are such that it's almost impossible for a city to come out ahead from hosting the Olympic Games. Now that's a different conclusion than you would expect if you simply listen to the Olympic organizers in different cities. Because there's always a tremendous amount of hype about it. They make it sound like it's the cat's meow, thank you very much, for local economic development. So I put two examples of extravagant claims that are frequently made. And the first one is from Sebastian Coe, who was the head of the London 2012 organizing committee. He said London 2012 was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to showcase everything that makes Britain great. They're going to put England on the map, as if people hadn't heard of England or hadn't heard of London beforehand. It's interesting that they were coming under a lot of criticism during the last couple of years building up to the hosting in 2012, because they had a cost overrun of 3.5 times. They initially projected it was going to cost about $5 billion to host the games. It ended up costing over $18 billion. And almost all of that was coming from the public coffers. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the process. And the London Organizing Committee put out a request for proposal from consulting firms to do an economic impact study. And the request for proposal said, we're coming under a lot of criticism, and we expect to come under even more heavy criticism, and therefore we're looking for a company to do an economic impact study that will make this seem like it's going to be very beneficial to the London economy. And the reason I know that is because a friend of mine worked for Grant Thornton, and he was part of the Grant Thornton team that responded to this request for proposal. So this friend of mine was working for Grant Thornton. They got the bid. They got $2 million. They paid $2 million for their economic impact study. And they got the bid. They're the ones that did the study. And my friend said they were involved in it for months and months, looking at the data, and they would have 2 or 3 meetings a week. And then all of a sudden, it's towards the end of the period before the report was due, he stopped getting called to the meetings. And they came out with this report, and the report said that there would be a $16.5 to $40 billion positive impact on the London economy from hosting the games. My friend said at the time that he left the group, that he wasn't invited anymore, they had exactly the opposite conclusion. They couldn't find any potential benefit whatsoever. And then I also have up here the claims that were made around the Rio Olympic Games, which will happen this summer. The organizing committee in Rio hired a group from Ernst & Young and also the University of Sao Paulo. And they came out, again, with rather extravagant and very positive projections about what would happen from hosting the Olympic Games. The scholarly evidence, the scholars who have independently looked at the Olympic Games, use econometrics. Basically, you look at correlations over time, and you try to control for other variables. So you look at when a city has hosted the Olympics, or when they've hosted the World Cup, or sometimes other mega events in a particular year, did that have an impact on gross domestic product? Did it have an impact on employment? And then you have to control for other variables, because during any particular year when you host, it might be the case that the economy was growing anyway, or it might be the case the economy was shrinking anyway. So you have to control for all of these other variables. And when you do econometric studies, you can try to isolate the effect of, if any, that the mega event had. And what these studies find time and time again is that there is no positive, statistically significant relationship between the Olympics and either income per capita or employment. There are a couple of exceptions, and I'll talk about them in a little while. All right, this is a listing of some of those studies, but I'm not going to talk about the details of them now. So let me try to suggest to you a way to look at what this is all about, and why we should not expect that there would be a positive impact. In the case of the IOC, it's also true for FIFA. I'm going to I think try to restrict my remarks mostly to the Olympics, just to rein things in a little bit. But in the case of the IOC, it's an international monopoly. IOC stands for International Olympic Committee. It's based in Lausanne, Switzerland. It's the only organization in the world that organizes the Olympics. Ted Turner had tried to do it with the Goodwill Games in the 1990s, and he failed. So the Olympics doesn't have any competition. There's one organizer. It's a very, very popular competition. We all watch it from time to time. There is no regulatory body that sits above the IOC. When we have monopolies in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission or the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department or some other branch of government can very often, they don't always do what they're supposed to do, but they have the opportunity, the ability to oversee things and either to bring legal suits against them or to curb some of the excesses of their behavior. But this is an international organization, and there is no international political body that has the authority or the ability to restrict what the IOC does. So it's an international monopoly. It happens to produce an enormously popular product. Now, every 2 years, alternating for the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics, what the IOC does is it goes out to the cities of the world and it says, bid against each other and convince us, the IOC, that you're the most worthy host city for the next Summer or Winter Olympic Games. And that's the basic model. Have all the cities, not all of them, but all of those substantial enough cities in the world who have an interest in hosting compete against each other, in essence bid against each other to convince the IOC that your city can produce a more luxurious, a more ostentatious, a more grandiose set of 17 days of sporting extravaganza than any other city. So cities start bidding against each other. Now, I think you can conceptualize this bidding process in a number of different ways. One of the things you can assume is that all of the cities who are bidding know exactly what their costs and benefits are from hosting that would occur if they hosted the games. They know everything. They know exactly the dollar value of their revenues and the dollar values of their costs. In a situation like that, each city, as it competes with other cities from around the world, would be willing to put forward a bid up to their expected benefits. So if we were bidding for Austin, Texas, and we expected Austin, Texas, not only expected, but we knew. Economists are famous for making assumptions. Let's just assume for a moment that we knew that $15 billion would come our way from hosting. Then as representatives of Austin, we would be willing to bid up to $15 billion, but not over. And in fact, as we were bidding against cities from around the world, we would bid all the way up to $14.999 billion, but then we'd stop. We wouldn't go over $15 billion. So that's situation number one. And in that situation where there's perfect competition, and what I would call no conflict between the principal and the agent. The principal in this example is the city of Austin, and we're the agent. We're bidding for Austin, and we're bidding in the interest of Austin. In that situation, no principal-agent conflict and perfect information, we would expect a zero net gain because we would bid all the way up to our expected revenue. So that's situation one. Situation two, which is a little bit more realistic, is allow there to be imperfect information. We don't know exactly how much revenue we're going to get, and so we're bidding without knowledge about how much our cost is going to be and without knowledge of how much our revenue is going to be. In that situation where you have multiple bidders and there's one bidder that bids more than everybody else, and they're the bidder obviously that will win, the IOC will take that bid, it's very likely that you have the phenomenon that's described as a winner's curse. Because everybody else except the winning bid believes that it's worth less. And one place that believes that it's worth more is likely overestimating. So that's a winner's curse, and there's likely to be a loss in that situation. But the reality is still worse than that, because the reality is that there's virtually always a principal-agent conflict, which is to say that the group that's bidding on behalf of the city does not represent the city's interests. At least it's not coterminous with the city's interests. Because what happens invariably when you have Olympic bidding is that a group of executives, primarily from the construction industry, sometimes from the insurance industry, sometimes from the hospitality industry, pull in construction trades, trade unions from the construction industry, pull in some investment banks that will be involved in floating the loans to finance the Olympics, maybe pull in some law firms that will be involved working for the different companies that are engaged. And then you have a group of industrialists from a local city, finance people, who then go to the politicians and they say, we want to do this. Politicians know that that group of industrialists can be supportive to them and important to them in future political elections. And it's that group of special interests, primarily centered around the construction industry, that leads the bid. It happens to be in the interest of that group that's leading the bid for them to bid as high as they possibly can. Not worry about the benefit to the city, worry only about the contracts are going to be larger and larger the more that they bid. So both because of international competition and because of imperfect information and because you have a principal-agent problem, you tend to massively overbid for the Olympic Games, which is to say that you propose to the IOC that you're going to build these 32 venues or 33 or 34 venues with the following amounts of money for each of those venues, and then you're also going to build infrastructure, and you're also going to take care of security, and that's add them all up, and that's the dollar value of your bid, or at least what you think it's going to be. So structurally, the situation works against the host city. So let me talk about some of the hardcore realities of what happens, and talk about it first in the short run, and then talk about the long run. In the very short run, what happens is that every potential or prospective host, every bidding city, spends somewhere between, or at least this has been the case in the last 10 years, spend somewhere between $75 million and $100 million just to carry out the bid. The bid process is a 9 or 10 year process. Remember, I said that New York was involved already in 2003 for the 2012 Olympic Games. So what happens first is that cities within a country bid against each other. So recently in the United States, we had a situation where Boston and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Washington, D.C. were chosen as the 4 finalists by the United States Olympic Committee to compete against each other to convince the USOC that they were the best U.S. representative. First they picked Boston, and then Boston dropped out, and then they picked Los Angeles. So they ended up, there was a 2-year process where the USOC picked first Boston and then picked L.A. Once L.A. was picked, then L.A. goes into another 2-year process with the countries from around the world. So L.A. is now in competition with Paris and Budapest and Rome. Hamburg was in it, but they dropped out. In September of 2017, the IOC will pick one of those 4 cities, and then they have 7 years to do all of the building and preparation for the Olympic Games. So put it all together, you're looking at a 9-year process during which you have to hire architects, you have to do drawings, you have to do slides, you have to do movies, you have to travel to Lausanne every couple of weeks to meet with the IOC, you have to make presentations, you have to hire media consultants and so on and so forth. And at the end of this time period, between 10 years or 9 years before the Olympics and when you host, there's about a $75 to $100 million cost just leading up to it, not counting any of the construction that you're doing. So that's one of the short-term impacts that it's important not to lose track of. So I'm now going to go on and talk about construction, tourism, cost overruns, and the financial balance in the short run. And we begin with a quote from Yogi Berra. Nobody goes there anymore because it's too crowded. So this is very important in understanding the impact of the Olympics on tourism. Invariably, you see the boosters for the Olympic Games saying, look, all these people are going to come to our city. We're going to be on the world stage, and millions of people are going to come, hundreds of thousands of people are going to come, descend on our city, stay in our hotels, eat in our restaurants, and it's going to generate all of this income. Well, what we know from London, what we know from Beijing, what we know from Salt Lake City, what we know from virtually every other Olympic host is that the traditional tourist stays away during the Olympics. The person who wants to go to London to see the London Theatre, wants to go to London to see the British Museum, wants to go to London to see the Tate Galleries, wants to go to London to see Big Ben and Buckingham Palace, that conventional tourist doesn't go in August of 2012, might not even go in July of 2012. Why not? Because they want to avoid congestion, they want to avoid traffic, they want to be able to stay in the hotel that they like or in an area of the city that they like. They don't want to have to pay higher hotel prices, and hotels often require, during mega event periods, they require any guest to stay for 5 days or 7 days, whereas they normally would let you come for 1 or 2 days. And perhaps they want to avoid what they expect could be unpleasant security incidents. So they have a good reason to avoid going to London. And in fact, London tourism fell by 6% in July and August of 2012. Beijing tourism fell by 30% in 2008. So there is not a favorable, or at least you can't depend on it. There are a few examples where tourism went up a percent or 0.5% point. It happened in Sydney. It went up for the couple of months of the Olympics and went down for 3 years after that. So it's possible, but certainly not something that one should count on. That is to say, increases in tourism during the Olympic Games. The European Tour Operators Association, this is a professional organization of tourism companies. And they're, of course, very interested to know what impact does it have when a city hosts the Olympics. And they've done multiple studies of different Olympic Games. And what they found time after time is that it doesn't promote it in the short run, and in the long run, it's deleterious to tourism. Why is it deleterious in the long run? Because they claim, and they have the evidence, that the best way to promote tourism is by word of mouth. To say, you go visit London, and you go back to your home, and you tell your friends, neighbors, and relatives, gee, London has great theater. Gee, London has great restaurants. This is what I did. And you describe your excitement to your friends, neighbors, and relatives, and then they say, we want to go to London too. But if you come back from having been at the Olympics in 2012, you tell your friends, neighbors, and relatives, I saw a wonderful breaststroke race. I saw a wonderful 100-meter relay, or whatever. Your friends, neighbors, and relatives can't go back to London to see those things. It might interest them to go to the next Olympic Games in Rio in 2012, but it won't interest them to go to London. So what it does is it makes you lose the publicity effect of word of mouth. And insofar as it's the case that every Olympic tourist who goes to London is replacing exactly one traditional tourist, so it's a one-to-one situation and there's no loss, even if that were the case, and it was actually worse than that, but if that were the case, then you're losing the advertising effect of having a conventional or traditional tourist go to your city. So another factor that's very important here is the ubiquity of cost overruns. There was a study done at the University of Oxford in 2012, University of Oxford in England, that looked at all of the Olympic Games since 1960. And what they found was that every single one of them has had a cost overrun. And they looked also at the Summer Games since 1976. And they found that in real terms, after controlling for inflation, the average cost overrun of the Summer Olympics between 1976 and 2012 was 252%, meaning that it was 3.5 times the initial bid. So why is that true? Why do we have cost overruns ever present? And there are no exceptions to that. What's going on? So one of the things that's happening is that when you initially have a bid to host the games, you want to convince politicians to go along with you. And the best way to convince politicians to go along with you is to suggest that it's not going to cost very much. So they go to the architects and they say, we want bare bones plans. We want a low ball estimate of how much it's going to cost to build the Olympic Stadium, how much it's going to cost to build an Olympic Village, how much it costs to build a velodrome, how much it's going to cost to build an aquatic center, and so on and so forth. And so for political purposes, there's an incentive to come out with a very low estimate initially. Once you get the initial political approval, then you can start adding the bells and whistles to your projects. And costs go up because the scope of the project changes. Another thing that's true about the Olympics that's not true for normal construction projects is that you have a firm deadline. The first day of the opening ceremony in Rio this summer, assuming that everything happens the way it's supposed to, is August 5th. The Maracanã Stadium in Rio will be the site of the opening ceremonies. The Maracanã Stadium has to be ready on August 5th. It can't be ready on September 5th. It can't be ready on August 15th. It can't even be ready on August 6th. It's got to be ready on August 5th. And the aquatic center's got to be ready on the first day of swimming competition. And so on for all of the venues. There's no leeway at all. NBC, you can't tell NBC and broadcasters around the world, by the way, we're not going to be ready on the 5th, so we're going to open on the 6th or the 7th. Can't do that. And NBC is paying billions of dollars for that. So when you have a firm deadline like that, and that doesn't exist if you're building a condo building. It doesn't exist if you're building a mall or retail center or commercial center. Sure, you want to be as on time as you can, but it's very common for there to be several weeks or even several months delay, as long as it gets announced with some lead time. Because you can't have, there is no give there. When you tell that to the construction company, you've got to sign a contract that guarantees, if you want to get paid, it's got to be ready on August 5th. The construction company says, okay, I get it. And that means I have to prioritize my labor force to work on this project. It means I have to prioritize the raw materials that I need to get to this project. And because of all of that, I have to transfer resources away from other projects. And instead of charging you the $120 million that we talked about last week, I'm going to have to charge you $180 million. And that's another reason why cost overruns happen. Still another reason, with immensity of construction that goes on when you host the Olympic Games, And it's not just the athletic venues. You have to build, sometimes you have to build metros. You always have to have at least special lanes, special highways, special parking. You have to have parks and green space, ceremonial green space. You have to have telecommunications infrastructure built. There's an enormous, you have to have an Olympic Village that hosts, that has 16,000 beds for athletes and their trainers. And that Olympic Village is not just rooms, it's restaurants, it's medical facilities, it's training facilities, it's tracks, lots of stuff. This is an enormous amount of construction. Whether it's an underdeveloped country like China, Brazil, or whether it's a developed country like England, the country, the host city is always in a mad rush in the last 2 years to get everything done. And when you're in a mad rush, you bypass normal competitive bidding procedures. And you start making deals in back rooms and behind the table. And that leads to, it leads to higher prices. It often leads to kickbacks and corruption. And when you put that in an environment like Brazil or Rio, which is historically legion with corruption, it goes completely haywire. So all of these factors and some others lead to this phenomenon of always having cost overruns and always having very large cost overruns. So if one looks at the last maybe 15 or 20 years, I think it's reasonable to conclude that, and somewhat optimistically, that the costs for hosting the games will run between $15 and $20 billion. I say it's optimistic because Beijing spent $40 to $44 billion. Sochi, Russia spent $51 to $67 billion. Brazil, Rio is spending $39 billion. But nonetheless, conservatively, I say $15 to $20 billion on the cost side. On the revenue side, from the Olympics themselves, you get somewhere between $3.5 and $4.5 billion. And again, if you're a developing country where you don't have all of the infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, hospitality infrastructure, road infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, then you're going to spend even more than this. So it's not a very good financial balance in the short run. In order to justify it as an economic investment, you'd have to have some kind of long-term payoff. There'd have to be something else that's happening in the long run that makes it work better. Let me just, before I talk about the long run, let me just pause for a moment to talk about the overall financial model of the Olympic Games. You'll almost always hear, and you even heard it in Sochi, Russia, you almost always hear that the organizing committee of the Games reports that there's either a balanced budget or a surplus. And the reason why they're able to say that is because they don't include all of the costs. There are actually 4 different types of costs, or 4 different buckets of costs associated with hosting the Games. One of them is the operating costs of the game. And usually when you hear these boosters say that they broke even or they had a surplus, they're referring only to the operating costs. These are the costs of the 17 days of the Games. Doing the security, doing the transportation, doing the hospitality, running the games themselves. That cost tends to be in the neighborhood, and the security tends to be in the neighborhood these days in the Summer Olympics, $4 billion, maybe $5 billion. That's just the operating cost. Then there's the infrastructure cost that we've talked about already. Then there's the cost of building the venues. And then there's security costs, which these days, London, they spent $1.6 billion. It's hard to believe that cost is going to go down over time. But somewhere between $1 and $2 billion is the security cost. The way it's very often suggested that the costs are going to be financed is through what are called private-public partnerships. And what these are is that the public sector puts out a proposal for some private developer. The proposal might be to develop an Olympic Village. Private contractor or the private developer has to pay, or in the model, the private developer puts down the investment to build the Olympic Village, $2-3 billion, something on that order. So it seems like it's a private activity. That Olympic Village, after the Olympics are over, gets converted into university housing or gets converted into condos or something else, and the developer gets to be the owner of that project. What's public about it? What's public about it is that the public entity, whether it's a city or a county or a state, says to the private developer, we'll make the land available to you. We'll somehow get control of the land. Not only that, we'll give you very large subsidies to do the project. Not only that, we'll give you tax credits and tax exemptions going forward for decades and decades. And so when the Olympic boosters go to the public and they say, it's not going to cost us any money, it's a private developer who's putting down the money, that's misleading because you're using public land, you're using public subsidies, granting tax credits that go on for decades and decades. If that land were used for some other development rather than the Olympic Village or rather than the Olympic Stadium, it would be subject to property taxes, it would have less subsidies. Somebody who was going to develop it would have to buy the land and so on and so forth. But there's no direct, in the short term, there's no direct cash outlay by the city. Now, one of the problems with organizing the Olympics around this model is that the private developer sometimes either doesn't materialize, this is simply a plan, and if the private developer doesn't materialize, then the city has to come in and do it. Every city that hosts the Olympics signs a financial guarantee with the IOC. There's one exception to that. It was Los Angeles in 1984. I hope I'll get a chance to talk about it. But before Los Angeles and since Los Angeles, the city signs a guarantee. And that guarantee is we have a plan. And our plan will be fulfilled whether or not we have revenue shortfalls or cost overruns. We will do that. We'll provide the financial backstop. We'll provide the resources. Even if the details of our plan don't work out, here are the venues, here are the highways, and so on. We're going to guarantee that all that happens. So when you use a public-private partnership and you hope you'll be able to induce a private developer to take the project, it doesn't necessarily mean that the project will be taken. It didn't happen in Vancouver with the Olympic Village. The developer didn't show up. They talked to a developer, but no developer signed on. In London, a developer signed on, started doing the project, and then pulled out. And in both cases, Vancouver and London had to pick up the slack. It wasn't actually London, it was the UK government that picked up the slack. All right, what about the long run? We have until 1:45, right? And we want to leave maybe 15 minutes for questions or so. Okay. So one of the characteristics of hosting the games that, again, is virtually ubiquitous is the existence of white elephants. As I mentioned that before. You build something, you build an Olympic stadium, and then you're going to use it not at all or use it very little after the games. So I talked about the New York Jets Stadium that never materialized because New York never got the Olympics. But if you look at the record, look at what's called the Bird's Nest, which was the Olympic Stadium in Beijing. It's virtually not used at all, except as a relic, as a museum piece for people who are visiting Beijing. If they want to see what the Olympic Stadium looked like, they pay, I think it's $8, and they get a tour of the Bird's Nest. To maintain that facility cost several $1 million a year. The amount of revenue, according to the New York Times, the amount of revenue that they get is less from the tours is less than $100,000 a year. You have examples of white elephants in Athens that hosted the Summer Games in 2004. Apparently, they built 22 new venues, and various reports say 21 of them have gone to seed. They're completely not used at all. To switch gears just a little bit, because we were talking about Rio and Brazil. Brazil hosted the World Cup in 2014. They built 12 new stadiums. They built a new stadium in 4 cities that don't have a first division soccer team in Brazil. So they built, for instance, a stadium in Manaus on the Amazon, way up north, in the middle of the country. Manaus has a second division soccer team that averaged 1,100 attendance at their games. People spent $2 for their tickets there. They built a new stadium with luxury boxes for the World Cup that has a capacity of 42,000. The stadium cost $300 million to build. In Brasilia, where they don't have Brasilia is the country's capital, they don't have a first division soccer team, they don't have a second division soccer team, they have a third division soccer team. And they built the soccer stadium there for the the opening games of the World Cup. And it cost $650 million. It has a capacity of 70,000. And now it was left for a third division soccer team with attendance of under 1,000. Apparently it's been converted now into a parking lot for buses. One of the most important things to think about with regard to the Olympics is the absence of meaningful planning before the Olympics comes to your town. If you want the Olympics, you have a set of requirements that are imposed by the IOC. If you want the IOC to pick you, you've got to meet those requirements. Usually, after you've met them, you say, now, to make this thing look a little bit better, what can we do? How can we paper over the white elephant? What kind of use can we put these facilities to? So it's very often that you get a little bit of use. But if you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build it and then spending $4 or $5 or $6 million a year to keep it up, and you have a little bit of use, that's a white elephant. And it's a white elephant not only for the facility itself, but what could have been instead. Just in my example with New York and Manhattan, Midtown, what could have been instead is you'd have an opportunity there in Midtown Manhattan to build a commercial and residential mixed-use development that could make an enormous amount of income and be a much more productive use of the land. And it's the same thing with all of the, to host the Olympic Games, you need something on the order of 5,000 acres in your city. Beijing used 8,600 acres. That would have been a third of all of the acreage in Barcelona. You're using up a lot of land. And as our population grows over time, urban real estate is more and more scarce. So you have to think about not only what's good for your city this year and next year, but what's good for your city in 10 years and 30 years and 50 years. It's often claimed that in addition to promoting tourism, which it doesn't, that hosting the Olympics will increase investment, foreign investment in your city, and it will improve your trade situation. Your trade with the rest of the world will increase. Those are interesting claims. Again, scholarly research finds that it's not true. It's just not true. And think about it. You try to be logical about why do companies invest in a city? Why do companies trade with a city? Well, if you're a successful company, you go to a city because it has good resources. It has skilled labor that you need. It has labor perhaps that's not very expensive. You can get the skilled labor at a reasonable price. You're looking for fiscal incentives. Is the tax environment appropriate? Are you close to your resources? If you're a mineral processing company, are you close to your minerals? Are you close to your markets where you sell your product? What is the financial market like there? What's the availability and price of loans? Those are the kinds of things that a real business will think about, and some other things, of course, will think about before they make $1 million, or $50 million, or $100 million or more investment in a city. You don't invest in a city because they hosted the Olympic Games. And indeed, the empirical evidence suggests that that's also the case. So let me just jump over a lot of these things because I'm running out of time. One of the things that stands out in Rio de Janeiro, and this summer, hopefully they'll host the games, is that those of you who have seen movies about Rio or been to Rio or seen photographs about Rio know that there are these shanty towns that are all over the city. There's over 1,000 of them. They're called favelas. And people who live in the favelas are low-income people. Many of the favelas don't have adequate services. Some have begun to develop. But the favelas are basically an eyesore. And if you're going to host the Olympics and you want to show the world what a beautiful and healthy city you have, maybe you don't want to have too many pictures of the favelas. And so when Brazil was awarded the right to host the 2016 games, that was back in 2009, they came out with a program, Morat Carioca, that was supposed to modernize the favelas. And by the way, the favelas, many of the favelas are ridden with drug gangs and drug problems and violence. And so initially they said, okay, we're going to change the standard of living. We're going to change the nature of the favelas. A few months into that program, they backtracked and realized it wasn't possible. And what they had to do instead was to wipe out the favelas. And so favelas, the area where the main Olympic cluster is going to be in Baja da Tijuca, has a favela there called Villa Autódromo. And that favela was on land that was going to be used for some of the Olympic venues. So they started clearing out the favela. And there are other favelas that are not there but are close by. And then there was a favela that was near the Maracanã Stadium, another part of Rio. And the Olympic organizers not only cleared out favelas so that they could have the land to build on, but they also cleared out favelas that were in eyeshot of where they were building so that the international television cameras and the international tourists wouldn't see the favelas. So altogether, they've evicted over 60,000 favelados, or residents of the favelas. So another thing that very rarely gets talked about in terms of costs of hosting the Olympic Games is that the IOC imposes some really strange requirements on the host city. One of the requirements has to do with taking care of all of the Olympic executives in high fashion. Another has to do with clearing out all the billboards in the city. Billboards on the streets, billboards on buildings, billboards in the metros, billboards at the airport, in the bus terminal. They all have to get cleared out, which means that the existing advertisers who pay the city money to use those billboards have to take down their advertisements so they can become available for Olympic sponsors, for the IOC itself. And that has to happen a month before the Olympics and stay that way for a month after the Olympics. So there's a period of 2.5 or roughly 2.5 or 3 months when all the billboard income goes away and the city has to take care of the costs, the labor costs of taking down and then putting the advertisements back up. It's a hefty cost. The time that politicians spend on the Olympics, it's remarkable. I mean, Mayor Walsh in Boston must have spent 30 to 40% of his time during the Boston bid when it was active thinking about the Olympics. People in his office were doing the same thing. There's an issue of environmental degradation. Since 1992, when the Winter Olympics were held in Albertville, France, and there was some obvious degradation of the environment, there was in the Olympic Charter a statement that says, we will promote sustainability. It stays in the Olympic Charter. In fact, it's gotten a little bit larger. They have it in many different places. We're going to promote sustainability. They don't have any environmental experts who are doing this. They don't have any particular metrics or guidelines to promote sustainability. They just say that they're going to promote sustainability. More recently, they've said they're going to promote affordability. But actually, even though that was highlighted in Agenda 2020, which was passed in December of 2014, it actually came onto the books in 2002. So they have a lot of public relations about we're going to do this, we're going to do that. There's no evidence that any of those things has happened so far. So there's some good news here. And I'm skipping over a lot of the bad news, but there is some good news. Part of the good news is that there's a feel-good effect. Generally speaking, I doubt that Rio will experience this. I doubt that Mexico City experienced it in 1968, or that Munich in 72, or that Montreal in 76 experienced. But most cities that pull off the Olympics without major incidents, the people feel pride, the people feel energy. There's a lot of volunteerism. There's a psychic uplifting sensation from hosting the games. That's a feel-good effect. It's a positive effect. It lasts usually for a couple of months, and then it goes away. Another thing that's often claimed as a benefit from hosting the games is that you can bypass political gridlock. You can bypass political gridlock. We all know about political gridlock, I think, in the United States. It happens at the level of the city in the United States. It happens around the world at the level of the city. The thought is that if you're hosting something as massive as the Olympics and you're being put on the world stage, then politicians find a way of appropriating money to get things done. And to some degree, that's probably right. The problem is this. that if you spend 15 or $20 billion hosting the Olympics, and maybe there are $2 or $3 billion of worthy projects that you'd want to do anyway, you're wasting a lot of money to get that done. And that if you're going to depend upon hosting the Olympics, which Mayor Walsh in Boston said is an opportunity that comes along once every 100 years, which I think he's more or less right. If you're going to depend upon hosting the Olympics to deal with political gridlock, then you've got a pretty poor political system. You better learn how to deal with political gridlock on its own, or the ability to plan for the future is not going to be available in your city. Now, I mentioned that there are two interesting cases that I want to follow up on. One of them is Los Angeles in 1984, and the other is Barcelona in 1992. When the 1984 host for the Summer Games was picked in the summer of 1978, the only city that was willing to host the games was Los Angeles. The prior Summer Olympic Games had been held in Mexico City, where there was political protests by the African Americans on the U.S. team, where there had been a student protest and 200 students were killed, where there was lots of bad publicity about pollution in Mexico City. Then Munich, where there was the terrorist incident at the Israeli compound and 15 or 16 people were killed. And then there was Montreal, which went 10 times over budget. By the way, the mayor of Montreal prior to the Montreal Games, Jean Drapeau, said the Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby. And they ended up with a $1 billion deficit in Montreal. So the three previous Summer Olympics to the 1978 choice for the host of the 84 Olympic Games had been in one way or another disastrous. And even in 1978, when that choice was being made, there was already a lot of political disputation about whether countries from the West would participate in the Moscow Olympics in 1980. And so only Los Angeles came forward to the IOC and they said, we'll host it. And the IOC all of a sudden lost its monopoly leverage, didn't have cities bidding against each other. And the Los Angeles people, led by Peter Ueberroth, laid down two conditions. They said, we'll do this. Condition number one is that you, not us, have to financially backstop the games. We're not going to provide a financial guarantee. Condition number two is you have to let us use our old buildings from when we hosted the Olympics back in 1932. So prominent among them was the Memorial Coliseum that's by the USC campus. And they also got to use dormitories at USC and UCLA as the Olympic Village. They didn't have to build a separate Olympic Village. So under those very special circumstances, and with pretty clever and efficient leadership and a new model for corporate sponsorships that Peter Ueberroth introduced, the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984 were able to turn a surplus, the surplus of $215 million. Didn't happen before, it hasn't happened since. But one of the things that the successful Los Angeles experience did was it got countries interested again, or cities interested again, in hosting the games. So the number of bidders from 1984 all the way up to 2000 just kept going up. The other successful games, I think arguably successful games, perhaps not as clear a case as Los Angeles, is Barcelona. Barcelona, Spain had been ruled by Franco, a dictatorial government, between 1939 and 1975 when Franco died. When Franco died, they started introducing democratic political bodies around the country. And in Barcelona, the city council and the regional government got together and they decided that the city that had evolved under Franco was not the city they wanted. One of the characteristics of the city was that a warehousing and factory district had sprung up between the main streets of the city and the Mediterranean Sea. So the city became closed to the sea. Here's this gorgeous city that has a wonderful location on the Mediterranean Sea, a wonderful climate, and the city was closed to the sea. And so they wanted to open the city to the sea again. They had some other ideas as well. So they developed, in the late 1970s, they started developing a plan that re-envisioned their city, things around. Most of that warehousing and factory district was already closed down. It was there physically, but it was not operating. So they redesigned the city. And then in 1986, they decided that part of this redesign and restructuring of the city would be compatible with and maybe even facilitated by hosting the games. So actually they made that decision in 83. They got awarded the games in 86. So they had a plan, a pre-existing plan, They use the Olympics to help facilitate the implementation of that plan. That has reversed the normal sequence. The normal sequence is there's no vision for a city, there's no cohesive plan for a city. The IOC comes and says, this is what I need, and the city gets on its knees and bows and says, okay, we'll do it. So the city puts itself at the service of the IOC rather than the city having a plan and using the IOC at the service of its plan. So those are more or less the comments that I wanted to make. I think it's a situation that's very difficult to resolve. International level, there is no body that stands above the IOC that can tell the IOC what to do. It's always possible that the IOC, because it engages in all of these excesses and puts cities and countries in very difficult situations, it's always possible that we can get back to a 1984 situation where nobody wants to bid, or very few countries want to bid. And in fact, it seemed like we were getting there with the 2022 Winter Game. There were 4 European cities. There was Oslo, there was St. Moritz, there was Lvov, there was Munich. They all dropped out, either through city council votes or referendums. They all dropped out. It was too expensive to host. So the IOC was left with a choice between Almaty, Kazakhstan, and Beijing, China. Here's the IOC, an Olympic charter that talks about democracy, that talks about human rights, talks about sustainability and affordability. They picked China. They picked Beijing, China. What is Beijing, China going to do? They're going to put alpine and Nordic skiing, or they're going to try to put them at 2 different sites, one 60 miles north of Beijing, the other 120 miles north of Beijing, both practically in the Gobi Desert. So one of those 2 sites gets 12 inches of precipitation a year. The other gets about 6. What are they going to have to do? They're going to have to make artificial snow. Where are they going to get the water from? Northern China is water-starved. To host the 2008 games, they had to invest $80 billion to divert water from southern China up to Beijing. So they're going to have to accelerate and expand that project. They're going to have to do a desalination project to get water to make artificial snow for those sites. They had to build they're building 2 high-speed rails to each of those sites, and they're refusing to release the data on how much those are going to cost, because they say they're going to build those rails anyway. So they're going to create ski mountains, cross-country and downhill ski mountains in northern China, where they don't have very much water, where they don't have natural precipitation, in a country where very, very few, only the super, super rich skis in the first place. And this is somehow supposed to be environmentally sustainable, supposed to be affordable. It's affordable, sure, because they're not telling us how much it costs, although there was an article in the Chinese press that said it was $5 billion. It was going to cost $5 billion or more to build all this. And by the way, that area of China happens to be China's breadbasket. It's the richest agricultural area. And now that area is going to be starved of the water that it currently has. This is a situation, I think, where the IOC puts out these charters and they say what they want to say. And basically, they do what they can do, and they get away with what they can get away with. It's possible that we'll get back to a situation countries say, we don't want to do this anymore. And that will change the balance of power. And maybe then we can do something that's more sensible. Because right now we have a model that was generated in 1896, when the modern Olympics started in Athens. And in 1896, it made a lot of sense to say, let's move the Olympics around every 4 years, so that everybody can participate, everybody can see the Olympics. But since 1964, we've had international satellite. And people can appreciate the Olympics without having it move around the globe every 4 years and engaging in this competition. So maybe something can happen at the IOC level, but it's not about to happen. And short of that, what has to happen, the only sensible thing for cities to do is to be extremely cautious and to bargain hard with the IOC and to say that this notion of the financial backstop is not workable. Thanks very much for listening. Happy to take any questions. Okay, you should go second. Okay. I didn't see.
So in Vancouver, for the Olympics years before, they made a new subway system called the SkyTrain, and it ruined so many businesses, and they've done
made up for it in what sense? I mean, the main outcome was that Vancouver had $1 billion debt that they had to pay off, and they had to put a lot of money into fixing up the Olympic Village, which apparently now they finally, as of a few months ago, they finally rented out the whole village. They made many promises to the Native Indian community because they took a lot of their land. And as far as I understand, none of those promises have been fulfilled.
Would it be useful to establish one permanent location for the Olympics? Like, there are several less densely populated countries in the world that would still act as desirable travel destinations. And I'm sure the IOC could implement some system to where different countries could still represent themselves every 4 years at the Olympics. So wouldn't it be useful to just have one location and not have to continuously destroy cities every 4 years?
Yeah, I think that would be very useful. It's hard to get there from where we are right now because the model that exists right now is a model that reinforces the grandiosity of the Olympics. That as long as you have cities bidding against each other and trying to take the technology and take the magnitude of the venues to the next level, then that's something that the IOC and its executives appreciates. So if you designated, for instance, that Athens would be a permanent city, it would freeze the venues and freeze the technology of the Olympics at a particular level when they were built. I'm not 100% certain that works all that well anyway. I mean, it's certainly a more rational model, but if in the most extreme case, if you had an Olympic stadium and you used it only once every 4 years, that wouldn't be a very good use of it. So you have to not only have it in one place, but you'd have to choose a place that could use the venues. And instead of saying Olympic stadiums have to have an 80,000 capacity, you should be more rational about it, more realistic, and say here's a country that could do it with 40,000. And we don't need 80,000 people cheering in the stands to watch it on television. 40,000 is enough. And you don't necessarily need luxury boxes. And you don't necessarily need X amount of square feet of signage available at the Olympic Stadium. So I think there has to be a redesign on several levels, but certainly it would be the case that having it in one city and not having it duplicated every 4 years, or replicated every 4 years, would make a lot more sense. And it's also possible, I think, to plan in a way so that it's not just the Olympics that happens there. So you can have, there's international track and field events that happen all of the time. There are international swimming events that happen all the time. Presumably there are ways to make better use of it, even if it was just in one city.
What are your thoughts on Rio as far as the political thing with impeachment going on and how far the construction of the events are going there?
It's crying shame and disaster what's happening. So the political events in Rio, I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with what's going on. The president has just been voted to be impeached by the House. The Senate has to ratify that, and she probably will be impeached sometime in the next couple of months. And they don't have anybody else to go become president because everybody in all of the political parties are implicated in corruption scandals. So politically, it's a complete mess. The preparations for the Olympics are not going well. To me, the most serious problem is not the Zika virus. That is a problem, but it's not that. It's the water pollution. So the three main bodies of water that are supposed to be used, the Guanabara Bay and the Freitas Lagoon and the Copacabana Beach, are all very, very, very badly polluted. The city doesn't have proper sewerage, doesn't have water treatment or proper water treatment. So 5 minutes I have? Okay, so the level of virus in these bodies of water that the Olympians will be competing in it's really frightening. It's so many times, thousands and thousands of times above what's recommended by the WHO. So that's bad. The metro that they're going to be building is Rio has awful traffic. And the plan was to build a metro that went from the airport in the north, then passed by the tourist beaches, and then went to the main Olympic cluster in Baja da Tijuca. First of all, it was a strange plan because Rio has this terrible traffic, and it wasn't going to help the traffic for the Carioca, the people who live in Rio. It was going to help tourists go to the tourist areas and then get to the Olympic cluster. But it's not clear that it's going to be finished. The velodrome where they do bicycling was not finished in time for the Olympic trials. Many of the other venues weren't finished. A lot of the power sources to the different venues haven't been contracted out yet. The problems just go on and on. The people in the residents of the favelas who are being evicted, many of them made deals, and they ended up getting moved to Western Rio, which by today's transportation standards, about 2 hours away from where they had been before. So the men can't stay in their jobs, the kids can't go to their schools, they're torn asunder from their communities. Some of the favela residents are protesting and staying in the favelas. It's just a really, and there's massive political demonstrations all the time right now. So it's interesting to watch, but it's a tragedy. It's a human tragedy. Do we have time for one more question?
Do you think with the U.S. having already the big football stadiums built, that they're a good candidate to host the World Cup with the size?
Yeah, we do a great job hosting. We hosted the World Cup in '94. We didn't build any new stadiums. We modernized a few, but we've got, now with MLS, we've got lots of soccer stadiums. We have larger stadiums. We have transportation, communications infrastructure. We could host the World Cup with very little problem. And Los Angeles, by the way, I should have said this, they're postulating to host or bidding to host the games, the Summer Games in 2024, the Olympic Games. And it's more complicated than I have time to explain, but basically they've got all the venues they need. And they're going to get some help from Comcast, NBC, and Universal City for a media center, and they're going to get help from USC in modernizing, and also Kroenke in modernizing the Memorial Coliseum. And so they're going to spend very little money. And the main expenditure will be by the U.S. government for security, perhaps $2 billion. So that's also, I think it's, unlike most of the other cases, I think that economically it's a plausible enterprise for Los Angeles. Thank you very much.